Hey folks, welcome back once again. So this week we're going to start looking at using imagery in our InDesign files. So far we've been focused on text, formatting it, and creating our documents, creating tables and that kind of stuff. But they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and imagery is a great way to add a lot of visual interest to your documents and to get people's attention, whether it's a flyer or a brochure or a book, whatever the case may be. Now, that said, it is still really important to pay attention to the finer details of text formatting and typography. That just really adds a polished feel to your document. It helps with legibility and people understanding what you're trying to communicate and all that. But this week, we're going to focus on imagery. Now, there are a lot of different things to deal with when we're talking about imagery, but there are some things that are familiar too, so hopefully it won't be too scary when we get started. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as our workspace. So we don't need the table panel this week. I'm going to go back up to our workspace area up here in the top right and go back to reset that week 2 workspace or week 3, whatever we created at the beginning of the semester, just so it goes back so we have the same visual workspace. Okay, with imagery, there's 2 parts to it really. There's the frame, just like we have a text frame that we bring text into. There are image frames that almost serve like a container. That's the way I like to think of it, for the image itself. And so you can kind of you can make changes to each one individually, and you'll see what I mean. We are going to use the rectangle frame tool. You can also use, if you click and hold, you can also see we have an ellipse frame tool and a polygon frame tool. But for this week, we're just going to use the rectangle frame tool. And I'm going to click and drag from one guide to the other and then down almost to the top of this text frame here. So you'll notice this is a text frame that I've created based on the things that we've already talked about. We have a headline, we have some paragraph copy with space before paragraphs from the paragraph panel, 1/8 of an inch. And then I spanned the headline across both columns. I removed the hyphenations and I set this to justify with the last line, a line left. All right, so this is all stuff that you can know how to do. This is just some placeholder text because we're not concerned so much with the text this week. So get my selection tool up here at the top. This is my container. This is my frame. And this is what I'm going to bring the image into. Okay, to bring in an image, you do the same thing you would do to import text, which is place. So we can go to File, down to Place, or the shortcut is Control-D or Command-D. Okay. And then I want you to go find that baseball player JPEG image that I gave you, okay? Now, there are a lot of things you need to consider when you're dealing with digital imagery, like the resolution is probably the most important thing, how many pixels you actually are working with, so you don't have a nasty pixelated looking image. You also need to think about the color mode and the file type, all right? In general, we're going to cover this more in some of the content in this week's Blackboard folder, but just for the purpose of this, you need to know that JPEGs and PNGs and GIFs are usually what we use for web content. TIFFs and EPS files are usually what we use for print. CMYK color mode is for printed graphics. RGB color mode is for web graphics or screen graphics. And then the resolution, basically with print, you want it as big as possible. 250, 300 pixels per inch is ideal for printing. On screen, you can get much less. You can have 72 pixels per inch, and that's kind of the standard screen graphic because it still looks good. Because we're looking at little dots of light on screen versus printed dots of ink on paper, so that's why there's a difference. But for the purposes of this, since we're not actually going to be printing this, we're going to use RGB JPEGs because the file sizes are much smaller than CMYK TIFFs. So it just makes it easier for transmitting things on the internet. So that's why we're using JPEGs. Normally, if you were going to print this out or send this to print, you would not use a JPEG for print. But we got our baseball player JPEG here. And we're going to click Open. And you're going to see it's going to pop right there into that frame. Now, the reason I say there are 2 pieces to this, because right now, if we were to grab a corner of this frame, I have my selection tool active, and click and drag it, you're going to see the frame changes, but the image stays exactly where it is. So I'm going to Command-Z to undo that. That's because we are making changes to the container, but not to the image itself. Now, if you double click on that image, you're going to see a brown outline. All right, so double click again, you get the blue outline. So that's how you toggle back and forth between the container and the image. All right, now you can make changes to both of them at the same time, but you have to hold a couple keys. So double click back to the brown outline, so we have our image. Now you'll see we get a little hand tool when our cursor comes inside the box, and we can click and drag around and change the placement of our image. And if you click and hold before you start moving, it's going to give you kind of a faded preview view of the edges of your image, so you kind of know what you're working with here. All right. Now, you can resize images, but whenever you do, this is very important. You need to hold down Shift to constrain the proportions. What that means is if you press Shift before you click and start moving anything, and you hold it after you let go of your mouse, whenever you move to resize things, it's going to keep those proportions consistent. If you don't, then you can do anything you want to, and it's going to get real distorted real fast, and it's going to look like an amateur. Nobody wants that. So just remember to hold down Shift to constrain your proportions. Now, if you were to mess that up, if I was to do this and say, oh dang, wish I didn't do that, you can look up here when your image is active, meaning that brown line. This is going to tell you the percentage of the full size. If it was full size, it would say 100%. So this is 80% horizontal and 54%. So if we needed to make this, to fix it and make it proper proportions again, we could just type in 80, tab down, and it's going to change it automatically because this is linked. It assumes that you want to keep your images looking the way they are originally. So just like with the placement of certain elements, we can adjust the placement of images. Now this is all, mind you, with the image selected, not the frame, but the image itself. We can adjust how tall it is. We can adjust the X and Y coordinates, so we can do very precise placement like that. I tend to, it's a visual program, so I tend to move around and use my eyes and hold down Shift and constrain things that way. Just make sure that if you do this method, you hold down Shift before you start moving your mouse, and you don't let go of Shift until after you're done moving and you let go of your mouse. All right, that'll constrain the proportions. So what I'm going to do is reposition this guy. I'm going to hold down Shift and resize him. Now, I said there are a few other key commands you can hold to move both of these things at the same time. And this takes a little while to get the hang of, just to remember those commands. But for example, if I hold down Shift and Option while I'm resizing the image, it's going to resize from the middle out, as opposed to if I just hold down Shift, I'm just going to resize from that corner, if that makes sense. So it really doesn't matter at this point, just it makes it a little easier as you start working with it more and more. Now if I double click and I hold down, now I have the container selected. If I hold down Shift and Command or Shift and Control on a PC and I click and drag, you see it's gonna, not only is it going to constrain the proportions, but it's going to resize the container and the image at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to Command Z to undo that. I just wanted to show you that you have some different options for moving these things around. It's pretty flexible. So I'm going to double click to get my brown outline here so I can resize it, and I just want to get this guy's shoulders and upper back in this picture, and I want to kind of have a little bit of the sky and the mountain range in the back there. And I'm using the rule of thirds. You want to pay attention to your image composition, the way it's cropped. The rule of thirds says you can put, if you don't know about that, you can Google it and learn about it. It's pretty fascinating. But the general rule is you want to keep horizon lines on either 1/3 or 2/3 of the image. You don't want it to be smack dab in the middle. You want to kind of have it split up into thirds. So I'm going to use that. That looks like a pretty good placement for my image. All right, so that's good. We got that one there. Now I'm going to show you how to bring in another image. So I'm going to get my frame tool again. I'm going to click and drag. Now whenever you create new objects, they're going to be stacked on top of each other. So right now this image that I just created, this frame is on top of this, and this is on top of this because of the order they were created. You can switch the order using arrange, bringing things to front, sending them to the back, that kind of stuff. We're not going to worry about that right now. So I have another rectangle frame here. I'm going to hit Command D or go to File, Place, okay, to go choose another image. And this time I'm going to bring in this baseball.png file. All right, and the reason I'm using a PNG is because PNGs can have transparent backgrounds. All right, now I bring this in and it's way too big. So I can double click and get that brown outline and hold down Shift and resize it. There's a shortcut though. So I'm going to double click to get back to my blue outline, the container. And if you right click or control click, you get a whole bunch of options. One of the options is called fitting. And under fitting, we have a lot of different ways that we can fit this image in this container. You can fit the frame to content, fit content to frame, fit frame to content, and I don't use these two very often. If you hit fit content to frame, it's going to distort your image based on the size of your frame. The one I use most often is fit content proportionally, or sometimes fill frame. But fit content proportionally, if I click that, it's going to shrink down my image based on the size of my frame. All right, so that looks good. Now what I want to do is have this in the middle of my text. So I'm going to click and drag this over. If you have smart guides turned on, you're going to get a magenta outline when you're smack dab in the middle. And I'm going to move it about right down here. So basically right in the middle of my text. Now I think that looks pretty good. I like the way that looks, except that it's over top of my text, so I can't read it. So this is where we're going to use text wrap, okay? So I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to show you something new with text wrap. So right now, no text wrap. If I click wrap around bounding box, what's it going to do? Well, now it's wrapping around the bounding box, but it's wrapping around that square, which if I hit W to preview it, that doesn't look very good, okay? So I'm going to try something else. So now I'm going to go to the next one. It says wrap around object shape. You think that'll work pretty good. Well, it works better, but see now it's wrapping around that brown outline, the image. And this is, I guess the dimensions of the image in Photoshop. Now, we're not going to worry about editing images, but normally InDesign and Photoshop go hand in hand so you can edit images in Photoshop and then they'll automatically update in InDesign. I'm going to show you where to find that here in a minute. But now, I want to try something else. If you with this selected, the wraparound object shape, you come down here to the bottom to contour options. Right now it says same as clipping, which is referring to the clipping path, which we don't have one. But if I click on this and I go up to alpha channel, all right, alpha channel pays attention to where there is color and where there isn't, basically. If I click on that, now you probably can't see it right now, but if I were to zoom in really close, there's a thin blue line going right around my image. And you'll see that the text bumps right up against the edge of that baseball. Now I don't want it to bump right up against it. So now that this is selected, the wraparound object shape, alpha channel is selected under contour options. Now I'm going to use this runaround is what it's called. Offset is what it used to be called, runaround in another program. Now they call it offset. But because it's a round shape, you don't have options to do all the different sides. It's just one side. And as I click that, you'll see this blue outline get a little bit bigger. So it allows you to have a little more space around that image. So I'm going to do a 1/4 inch and see how that looks when I zoom out. All right. So I'll zoom out a little bit, hit W to kind of preview it. And that looks pretty good. I feel like this is a little bit small though, so I'm going to resize it. Okay. So I'm going to click on this, and I want to resize both the frame and the image at the same time. So I'm going to grab a corner. I'm going to hold Shift, Option, and Command, or Shift, Alt, and Control, and click and drag out, and it's going to make it bigger, both the frame and the image, and it's going to do it from the center out since I already have it centered. It's not necessarily a requirement. It's just the way I want to do it because it's a little bit easier. All right, but basically I want to get that image a little bit bigger. Now, this is just a personal thing, I don't necessarily like the way that this is, the seams look. So I want to rotate this a little bit. You can also rotate images just like you can resize them. You can either rotate the container or you can double click and rotate the image itself. In this case, it doesn't really matter because it's a circular object. So whichever one you want to do, You click and rotate. Now, if you hold down Shift, it's going to go in 45-degree increments and stop. All right? It'll kind of snap to them. So I just want to rotate about 45 degrees. And then let's see how that looks. That looks great. All right, so we're almost done. Now, anytime you bring an image in to InDesign, it's called a link, because it's basically a preview of the real image. This gets into production a little bit, but what you're seeing is a preview of the image, and it's a link to the actual image file. All right, so I'm going to click on my links panel, and you can see baseball player JPEG and baseball PNG. So this allows you to check if you update files in another program. You can see if you have the most recent version here. And there's all sorts of reasons you'll need to use that moving forward. Right now, we don't really need to. I just wanted to show you where you can find that information. It's in the links panel. Okay. If you want to check on your color mode and your resolution and all that kind of stuff, you can open up the info panel, and that's going to show you based on what you have selected. It'll show you exactly where your cursor is. You'll see the X and Y move around. But if I double click to get that brown outline, so my image is selected, it's going to tell me this is a JPEG. It's 300 pixels per inch. The effective pixels per inch is 336 because it's slightly less than 100% viewing. All right, and the color space is RGB, and then the profile. So a lot of information you need there, as well as the exact placement of it and whether it's rotated or not. All right, so info and links are pretty useful for getting information about your imagery. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I like the way this looks. The only problem is, and I wonder if any of you have figured this out, is now we have overset text. All right. Now, in this case, it's just placeholder text, but if this were a real article, then we'd be in trouble because we're not seeing the end of our article here. We have that little red cross, which means we have too much text. And that's because we brought this baseball in and kind of pushed text to the side, which made it kick down. I always think of page layout as putting a puzzle together. All right, it's very helpful, except it's a little more flexible than a puzzle because you can change the way all the different pieces look. So it's kind of just moving things around until you get all the pieces looking the way you want them to look. So in this case, I like the way this looks, but the text is running off. So what I need to do is resize my elements. So I'm going to grab the top of this text frame and click and drag up. And if you hold a little bit, then you can see the preview in real time. All right. So I'm going to click and drag until I get the end of my text. And there it is right there. Okay. Now I have text under my image. That's not good. So I'm going to click on the image and drag the bottom of the container up until I see my headline. Now, if you don't see the preview, that means you didn't hold down long enough. So click and hold and wait a second. And then when you start dragging, you'll see the preview. I'm going to put it right above my title, so I have the same amount of space above and below it. That looks pretty good. Now, I might bring the baseball up a little bit just so it's centered within that text. But you also want to look at the way that things are flowing. And now see, I've got a little overset text because I moved that. So I'm going to use my arrow keys a little bit just to fine tune it. That looks great. That's exactly how I want it to be. That's how yours should look to turn in. Now, I'm not concerned about the precise measurements. Like yours doesn't have to be exactly negative 0.7185 inches. It can be, but I want it to look about like this. So if yours is off a little bit, that's okay. What I'm looking for is that you have found a way to simulate the way this is within a few degrees of accuracy. All right. So now you've learned about text, you've learned about image. Now we can really start to have some fun.